welcome everybody to the security operations session here, sponsored by BlueVoyant. Really, what Chris and I hope to do today is talk about how modern information security professionals have to balance their program and portfolio. One of the biggest decisions in that is what is the cost and resourcing that I provide for my security operations function, right? That can be an internal approach, that can be an external outsource approach, it can be a hybrid approach. So hopefully today we get some time to chat with you about what impacts that and how to think about those teaming relationships, fully internal, fully external, and hybrid. But we're going to start with a quick introduction. So Chris, if you wouldn't mind giving your background, I'll jump in after that, and then we can talk about security operations.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Chris White. I was one of the first employees hired into BlueVoyant when we formed the company about 5 years ago now. I've served as our primary architect for all things security in terms of what we do internally as well as externally in the form of products and services. And prior to joining BlueVoyant, I was a 10-year veteran of consulting, half of which was in the intelligence community and broader DoD, building secure systems, and the other half was building out commercial practice on cybersecurity, primarily focusing on security operations platforms and the technologies and integrations that need to go into building those things out.
Outstanding. Thank you, Chris. My background is fairly similar. I spent 15 years working for the federal government doing, offensive, defensive operations, and then jumped out, took a downshift in the speed and lifestyle of deploying around the world to move out here to Denver. Spent some time working in a large telecommunications provider as one of the leaders in their security operations program, and then spent the last 4 years doing incident response and security operation builds for Mandiant. Lots of clients in the financial and high-tech industry, as you would expect here on the West Coast, Mountain and West Coast. And I've been here at EVOTEK for about a year and a half, doing solutions architecting for security problems in our client space. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we are. Chris, I'd like to start off the questions honestly with kind of the approach that I get from many of our clients. Many of our clients are asking for a particular solution to support their security operations program, endpoint technology, a SIEM, a SOAR, those kind of things. And regularly I step back with them and I ask them, why are you doing this? What is your intent? And so really driving out why you're doing a security operations program can really provide the context around how to properly team for that and create and bring in the tools for that. And so just like kind of at a high level, your thoughts on what is the why for security operations? What are those things to consider? And then we can dive into maybe a couple particular parts of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think in general, the best strategy is whoever is selling the hardest at RSA and Black Hat is what you need to get as your next tool. But in all seriousness, there is a lot of activity. There's a lot of heavy marketing still in this industry. And there always has been, because people feel the need to take a best of breed approach because they keep learning about new problems. What I think and what I advise many of our customers to do is to take a step back. And as you said, think about what you're trying to solve and position that in the context of what are the specific threats to your organization. You have to do that threat modeling exercise up front before you start worrying about what controls you have and what controls you need to get. You need to do that regularly. You need to do it at a minimum every year. And then you should do soft evaluations at least every quarter to make sure you know what it is that you need to be defended against before you start looking at those controls. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And kind of follow on to that. When you're looking at your threat, how would you kind of categorize those? And generally speaking, obviously everybody is unique, but generally speaking, based on the threat models that you've kind of create for yourself, what would your recommendations be on how you decide whether or not to do internal SOC, external SOC, if you need the pros from Dover that have, former 3-letter agency, credentials? How do you make those kind of decisions? How does that impact that?
Yeah. I think the first piece, once you've understood your threat, once you've understood the framework of things you need to defend yourself against that threat, you have to look at your business and understand what your core competencies are as a business and how those relate to security. So I see security largely as a data problem, a big data problem. There's an awful lot of telemetry out there that needs to be mined if you're going to detect advanced threat actors. Are you an organization that has or is building or needs to build a big data capability? Or is that not something that's really ever part of your business strategy as a firm, as an organization? Because if it's not, you should really start thinking about some form of outsourcing, because there's not going to be a business reason to justify that level of investment if it's not part of a broader business or technology strategy for your organization. And it's not just as simple as talking about data and data platforms. It also gets into, understanding all of the sources of data. So endpoint management, endpoint technologies, cloud technologies. Are we very heavily invested in cloud? Are we moving to cloud? Are we moving to cloud in the form of SaaS applications? Or are we moving into the cloud in the form of infrastructure applications, building our own apps on top of infrastructure? Completely different ramifications for what resources you might have at your disposal and what you're really going to have to seek as a service or as a solution from somebody else.
Absolutely. And I think that drives to, on the threat side, that drives to kind of an interesting conversation around where you are and what the attackers are really interested with your organization, right? If you're creating something net new that's doing large financial transactions, or you have ties to defense industrial base or high intellectual capital in the biomed space, that's a very different space than not downgrading it, but very different space than e-commerce, right? Where there's a lot of money moving through there, but it's not the same, as a big financial firm. Or if you're a mom and pop legal firm, right? What is the impact there? It's probably different if you're working in New York City versus, having LA or New York City or LA clients versus, some smaller businesses. So how does that impact that decision and that threat model?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of things there, which I really want to unpack. I think first and foremost, you got to think about yourself as a target, and you need to think strategically about that. A lot of organizations say, well, I don't have anything interesting that somebody would want to steal, but would they want to ransom it? Would they want to disrupt your operations? Would that be extremely lucrative if they did that and said, hey, all you have to do is pay me $40 million and you can go back to work? More strategically, are you interesting not because of what you have, but because of who you know and who you have trusted relationships with? So think of different types of service providers, legal service providers, professional service providers, accountants. Yeah, in many cases, they have some really interesting data, but what they really have is explicit trust with their customers. So you can go after one of those firms as an entree into dozens, maybe hundreds of other firms. So you have to consider yourself as a third party, and are you an attractive vector to get into your customers, your business partners, and other organizations?
Absolutely. And so I think what I'm hearing is, depending on your customers, depending on what services you're providing for the world, that may adjust or impact how the attackers view you and raise or lower the threshold for or the likelihood of an attack. Is that fairly accurate?
I think that's right. Look, if we try to boil it up into like a really high level framework, I would think about what is it that I do of value, and how could that be disrupted? Would it be theft? Would it be some sort of, operational ransom, stop me from building something, stop me from shipping something? And then you have to look at things like data. Do I have attractive digital assets in the form of intellectual property, in the form of digital information, which if stolen would be really attractive to ransom by saying things like, oh, if I leak this on the public internet, someone's going to be really angry. It's worth a lot to you and or the data owner for me to do this. And the last piece is that third party linkage. Am I attractive because my compromise could lead to the infection of many other organizations? So that's kind of the three things that I want to consider at a very high level, and then peel the onion back to understand how my organization might be at risk.
Absolutely. I love that. And so we're starting already into a cost benefit analysis discussion, the cost for the attacker, the cost for us to keep ourselves secure, and also the cost of what does that look like inside my environment and my relationships and partnerships. And so kind of pivoting off of that, we look at a lot of news about the information security community being really kind of low on or in a dearth of a bathtub of resources, right? And so getting fully qualified, fully capable people into your organization to run the tools, run the processes that you're employing really is kind of a trade-off and a benefit analysis. And so how do we guide our customers, our consumers, our partners on that balance and understanding where they are in the space as far as the cost of a possible attack and the cost of securing and creating a security operations team that works? Where does that conversation start?
Well, so it's a great question. I'd start with, the line that you and I have been discussing for the past, 10 minutes or so around threat modeling, deriving an impact analysis from that to get a sense of how big the cost is if these things happen, right? Data theft, ransom process, whatever the case may be. My reputation if I become an entree into hundreds of organizations because I get compromised, that type of thing. But then when you start looking at the cost of defense side, it does go back to that core competency again. So is security part of my brand? I think of some of the largest banks in the world, and security is a part of their brand. They even, to some extent, kind of compete with one another, saying, well, you're going to have the most secure credit card experience, which is, potentially a differentiator from them. Although I'd argue people who have a more seamless, mobile app for banking and add a crypto feature might actually be a heavier weight, but they feel as though it distinguishes them. They've made that choice that security and the investment in it is relevant to their brand, and therefore they've justified the business case to hire in and have their own staff associated with that. The other factor that I'd bring in is how much of what I do and what I need to protect is truly unique to me. How much of my culture doesn't look like anybody else's culture? How much of my development process is truly unique to me? And the reason I say that is if there are attributes of your business that are not technical, that are people-oriented, that are data-oriented, and those that are business and cultural-oriented, those are things that are much harder to outsource. Those are things where you probably need some form of team to be able and go and look at that level of detail to understand things like, is this an insider threat scenario? Is this an actual data theft situation? Is this my core application breaking, or is this my core application being compromised? That's going to require people who really understand and work daily with application owners, HR, legal, whatever the case might be. Outside of that, even some of the largest organizations like the large banks that I mentioned and other large Fortune 100 companies are kind of saying, it doesn't make sense for me to buy talent that is looking at the type of cyber attacks that are more one size fits all, ransomware, brute force attempts at the perimeter where they're just really looking for low hanging fruit. I mean, that kind of expertise is really hard to get, retain, and scale, but it's also not unique to each business. And so there's really an argument to be made that should be outsourced, because why would you make the additional investment to attract and retain talent when there's so many organizations who are making that investment? And with SOC analysts, with responders, those folks get bored really easily. They don't like just working on the same financial use case, the same government use case, the same, you pick the industry or the vertical. They want the spice of life. They want to work across industries as much as they can. And while they want that, will they be able to go as deep into the nuances of your application as you will? No. So if you've got an app, you got to think about where you draw the line on stuff that's unique to me and stuff that really should be moved to a shop that scales that type of cyber operation.
No, that is great. There's two great points in there. I think the first one that I'd like to pull on is that availability of resources and understanding whether or not this is a core competency, right? Without getting into too many details, I worked with a technology company at one time who was great at technology, right? Into the cloud, early adopters, had some amazing engineers, right? And they early on were ahead of that curve, that uniqueness curve that you talked about, right? They were doing things that nobody else was. And as time progressed, more and more people started adapting the cloud, adopting SaaS architecture, and there was more understanding of the security profile around there. But originally, they had made that uniqueness decision, and they had said, okay, yes, we have a lot of customers data on their customers, right? And partnerships and relationships data. That's a high security, high protection model, right? I need my people that I'm working with to trust me. And so they had made that investment early on in creating a security operations team that created their own security tools. Honestly, they had uniqueness in platform and they had uniqueness in infrastructure. But at some point, they had hit that break point where I don't want to say everybody else caught up to them, but that infrastructure approach, that SaaS approach was much more common. There were a lot more security tools. There were a lot more understanding of the industry, and ushered a change as a new CISO came in. And I watched the transition from, well, we're really unique to, well, maybe we're not so unique anymore. And that particular CISO said, look, I want you to be watching the walls. I don't want you to be creating these new tools, right? Because the tool set that we have is really good, and we can add to that what's going on in the industry, right, to solve a lot of our problems. And so there was a very, very clear cut for them to make that transition from, okay, we're insourcing not only our security operations, but development of tools, development of processes, to, okay, that's become commoditized as cloud and SaaS has become more commoditized. Let's shift more towards the analytics side of things. We've got so much volume. That's really our problem. Have you ever seen a transition like that, or is that unique to the experience I had with that client?
Man, that is well, I think there's elements of that experience that are pretty unique in terms of identifying the threat and doing the analysis that determines you got to build your own tooling to address that. That can be pretty unique. But I mean, I've seen some instances of that in certain pockets. I think that is a transformational journey, bar some of the technology specifics there, that organizations will undergo, where they will start to understand which parts of their business and their operations are potentially not unique and are a little bit more commoditized. And therefore, you need to take a different right-sized approach for those pieces and focus a different way around the things that are unique. I think that is pretty common. I'd argue, in some organizations like startups that begin to rapidly mature and, grow as a company and grow their understanding of security, I've seen some organizations say, hey, there's more of this that I now need to do myself because I now know what my crown jewels are. I now fully understand that it's actually not my application. It is the remaining human interaction that people get or that customers get outside of what they get from my application. And that's where I need to focus on making sure that there's no identity theft or compromise of that experience, because that's what my customers say my number one feature is, or their number one value prop from their experience. So I think those transformations are common. I think they can go both ways. But I think that's the important part of, not just the threat modeling exercise, but the overall exercise of stepping back and trying to understand, what is core to my business, where are my core competencies, and what should I really be thinking about that's unique and needs to have unique protection, and what doesn't.
That's a really interesting point that you bring up there, kind of the inverse. And I agree with you 100%. There's probably more people on the inverse transition from, low security to high security needs. But our keynote speaker yesterday actually brought up this idea of cybersecurity poverty, right? You look at the small businesses that are in the maybe 30 to 100 or maybe even 500 employees range that can't afford and really take on security in any meaningful way, much less security operations and running their own SOC. And so we've got to help them understand, okay, what are some of the inherent and native security tools and techniques that they can use on the platforms they're using, whether it's, cloud-based SaaS apps or it's things like O365 and Microsoft and their ELA infrastructure, their E3, E5 licenses. And so that transition from kind of using those core security tools to get me off the ground to, okay, I am now a Fortune, 500 company. I've got compliance issues because I've got customers all over the world, and GDPR and many other regulations are now hitting me. I've transitioned out of, okay, I can use commoditized security to more unique security.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, I'm glad you brought that up, because when I heard the term security poverty, it immediately resonated, and the snark in me wanted to add onto that and say, and it's partially driven by compliance debt. And the reason I say that is only, looking at many organizations that are smaller and less mature, that are laden with security compliance obligations and don't have the ability to do it the right way. And what it leads to is bad decision making, where you try to throw a tool at the problem because somebody has really good marketing for that tool, but you're not able to really understand that it's more than just a technology problem. So, so in addition to what you were getting there, to your clarification, which is correct, I think there's also an evolution going on in the cybersecurity industry where the larger providers of IT security, and that's becoming there's a little convergence there, right? I mean, you mentioned Microsoft. That's a great example of an organization that was kind of all IT and didn't have security as a core competency. And now, not only is it a core competency, but it's a core business line for them. They're trying to make it easier to do the right thing, no matter how big you are. And I think we'll continue to see more and more of that, not just from the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons of the world, but you'll see this movement where solution providers don't just become a nebulous term. It becomes an easier way of consuming the right things that you need to do, so that you as an organization, particularly on the smaller end of the spectrum, can focus on growing your business and can provide just the right of amount of touch and direction to a solution provider, so that your risk is managed without you having to, distract yourself from your core business functions. That's what I think we're going to see. That's what I hope we're going to see, because that's what we need.
Absolutely. You'd hate to see a small business go down in flames because they invested their first $1 million in a security product, right? Setting all that aside, that kind of hyperbolic nature or comment aside, not only are we dealing with uniqueness in what each business does with our clients, but we're also dealing with some uniqueness in the way that they're approaching their IT, and there's some uniqueness to security operations as we transition from, say, data center centric to cloud centric, to automation from heavy reliance on analysts to heavy reliance on automation, to pushing versus pulling events and triggers. So let's talk about some of these impacts on where security operation is going and what that means to me as kind of a consumer of security operations if I'm in a hybrid or an outsourced model.
Yeah, absolutely. I think regardless of the model for how you as a business are consuming security operations, whether it's internal, hybrid, outsourced, we've heard a lot around automation. Unfortunately, I think we've also heard a lot around machine learning and now AI. All of these are real concepts. I don't know that they're all at the stage that marketing within our industry says they are. Quite frankly, I think most of the thought leaders around artificial intelligence are still within the largest organizations focusing on different cloud initiatives and automated driving. But the reason for those buzzwords is there is a very clear need to address the staffing shortage. You've seen managed security service providers grow very rapidly because they provide a quality and scalable approach to this. It's not enough. It's not enough. And it's not enough from there's not enough people to solve this problem perspective. It's also not enough from a threat perspective. What people don't realize is cyber adversaries, and I'm not just talking about nation states, but cyber criminal organizations, they've got a lot of the same forms of technology, including automation and even machine learning algorithms, which are research artifacts published by universities all over the world that anyone is free to use. They make the investment to leverage these to attack at scale, to scan for vulnerable infrastructure on the internet and correlate that with open source intelligence information and say, hey, it's going to be a good thing for us if we go and exploit this, because it's going to allow us to make this type of return through a ransomware as a service transaction or some other form of of technique. So the automation is necessary not just to replace people. That's really a secondary thing. The automation is necessary because the adversary is using it, and we have to have automation and machine learning techniques that allow us to be faster than they are. And you'd be shocked at the sophistication of the techniques that they're using. So, you do need to take a hard look at what is being automated and why is it being automated, and how are more advanced concepts, primarily machine learning, being leveraged. And are they just being leveraged in the way that's checking the box for marketing, or are they actually being applied to solve the right problems? Is this about reducing the number of people because we want to control costs? Because again, that is secondary, tertiary even. It needs to be about, how does this enable people, the experts that you have, to move faster? Does it reduce the number of seconds they spend on a single screen so that they can get to remediating a ransomware issue before it spreads faster? Does it allow them to connect the dots between a ransomware event on an endpoint in a production server environment and the IT individual who was attacked in the ultimate source through a phishing campaign? And can they then remove the inbound phishing emails from all of the other inboxes for the others that were part of that phishing campaign? It's connecting the dots to move faster, not just trying to save on headcount and costs.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, I think both are valuable to the business. One of the pieces that I found really interesting in that discussion from you was the fact that the adversaries are using economy of scale and automation at this point, something that we haven't probably talked about enough in our industry, right? That automation allows them to identify targets and rapidly move on those targets. That said, if we look back 10 years ago, pre-MITRE attack and Mandiant's APT1 report, there was a bit of a, there wasn't a whole lot of information about how attacks happened in the commercial industry. It was tucked into pockets of either very advanced security firms or big banks or defense industrial base or DoD itself. I don't think that's true anymore, right? The MITRE attack lifecycle gives us a really good understanding of what that looks like, all the way down to the platform level, where we're talking, operating systems or cloud or, whatever that is. That's much more well mapped. And in that, it allows automation to do a lot of that collection. You can put automation in place to understand where the attack has moved from a single event or alert in that MITRE attack lifecycle very quickly, right? And so we can use those economies of scale to not only relieve our need for having 100 analysts sitting around watching each phishing email come in, but also to very quickly understand what the scope and impact of a particular event is in our space. And I think that's a very big change. Honestly, most of the MSSPs and MDRs that I work with, I think, are leading the charge on that, right? Because that's what they do every day. They've got to do that economy of scale, right? And so the question you have to ask yourself as a business person is, if I do insource my security operations team, am I able to keep up with that maturing MITRE attack and automation and all those kind of things? And have I hit that inflection point? Or am I better to rely on, if you will, the pros from Dover that are doing that on a daily basis? Going back to our uniqueness discussion, right? Like, is my environment that unique, or does my MSSP partner have that capability and capacity to say, okay, I've watched bank over here get this, your bank over here, let me connect the dots and beat the bad guy to the curve?
Yeah, I think if I could draw one piece out of that, let's say you're a large organization that completely insources its SOC. No business executive ever said, the metric that matters to me is how many unique detection mechanisms we have that nobody else has. What they want to hear is that we're sharing those things with the community and making sure that we're driving lessons learned, because other organizations will do that in turn. We survive together, not by hoarding and stovepiping. And I think there's still some stovepipes in parts of the government potentially that are being worked on, but aren't quite there yet. I think the metric that any SOC owner, whether they're an MSSP or they're completely insourced or hybrid, needs to go for is, how much am I contributing to the community? And if I'm buying a SOC, I'm not interested in 3,000 correlations and analytics that you've developed that are proprietary. I don't think any of your stuff should be proprietary. I'm interested in, are you contributing 10 times as much or 5 times as much as a SOC of a similar size? What are your metrics that show how rapidly you're learning about the evolving threat and then moving to tackle it? That's the special sauce, right? Is how quickly you're moving to tackle that, not the actual bits and pieces that you're doing that you have to accomplish that. That should be for the community, right? And you should just be a leader in how you're contributing to the community.
Absolutely. I love that, right? Even if you insource your security operations, it's still a team sport, right?
Yeah.
You've got industry partners, you've got threat intelligence providers, you've got your technology stack providers that can really help you, and you need to continue to leverage that community of support, even if you're doing it primarily insourced.
Yeah.
One of the other things on this automation, and we kind of touched on it, but I'm not sure if all of our listeners at home really pulled on this, right? The automation allows us to not necessarily consume all of our data all at once, but it allows us to say, okay, I've found some places where I need to go out and grab data and extra data for contextualization, correlation, using telemetry, threat intelligence, and those kind of things. And what I'm seeing, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, is there are some providers out there are some startups out there that are really looking to shift from I'm going to push everything into my SIM and then figure out what to do with it later, to I'm going to have some key events or some key data sources, and then I'm going to collect through automation all the telemetry to support and confirm that this is really something I need to pay attention to. So where does your view on that push versus pull, technical support or technical infrastructure?
So we're going to have a separate session on this entirely because it's one of my passion areas. Well, I'll give a summary though, because this is a tremendous topic, and I'm so glad you brought it up. I think historically what we've seen is that the community has kind of said, the more data, the better, because we don't know if we're going to need it. And so all security data kind of had this like single uniform price tag, and the solutions out there to mine this data were kind of priced that way. I think what's happened is that as we've matured as an industry, we've determined that not all security data has the same use case. Not all of it has the same security value. There is data that should be purely for compliance in frozen storage in an archive, just so you can check a box if you ever need to. Or, look, in the event of like a capital B breach or capital I investigation where, you're looking at 300 plus days of dwell time, and you have to go unfreeze that data because you've got the FBI and everybody else trying to look over this long time period. You might want to use it for that use case too. But outside of that, it should be in the cheapest storage possible. There's data that you want only if you've got a tipper that says, hey, we need to now go comb through all of this information. And then there's data that you need every single day, every minute, as fast as you can get it to detect in real time. So, and that's just a high level, broad brush view of it. You can get into a lot more granularity, and there's actually a white paper that you can read. I think the single pane of glass is not dead. The single pane of glass has evolved into a smarter pane of glass that, the industry hasn't settled on the terminology, but is it about setting up the right repos aligned with the right data based off of that data's security value, and then setting up the right types of pipelines so that you can call on that data when you need it at the right speed, given the circumstances, because the circumstances may change. You may get new threat intel that says that data needs to come in because there's a new detection response use case. So shift it over. It's got to go into the detection response platform. Or you might say, hey, we are doing an investigation. We need to figure out how to query over these very different repositories because we're going into the application data, which we don't normally pull into that type of a regular feed. So that I think is what we're going to continue to see. We're seeing this from the vendors. We're seeing this from all the big names in next generation cloud native SIMs. And I think it's largely being driven by cloud because that movement has generated a lot more telemetry to analyze. And so we need to think very carefully about what goes into high cost compute detection and response and what goes into a lower cost structure.
Thanks. I was hoping you'd help me out with that transition from the data center to the cloud, and I want to pull on that for a little bit because security follows IT, right? And yes. What I'm seeing, the futurists in me, if you will, are out there hopefully seeing a shift. When you were working in a data center and you were building your IT infrastructure around your data center, you had to worry about everything from power, space, and cooling all the way up to the top of the stack, right?
Yeah.
what we're seeing now as you move to the cloud is I'm now doing a consumption model, right? Like we were talking about with our event logs and our alerts, it's a consumption model. I'm consuming resources from compute, storage, and identities, right? And those are my core capabilities, my core consumption is really around those three things. I need to create an identity of something. I need to offer or consume some resources, storage or compute in order to produce a product. And in that, I think that shift from managing the whole stack to a consumption model, there's a change that needs to happen with the information security team. And I know you guys at BlueVoyant have absolutely embraced that with some of your acquisitions. We won't go into that detail, but tell me about where your headspace is as far as moving and supporting that cloud consumption-based model.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with a joke. One of my favorite t-shirts growing up, or at least in college, was, hey, coffee, do stupid things faster with more energy. And cloud is kind of the, hey, make riskier decisions for your business faster and for more money. And that's a snark. That's the snark in me. But what I mean by that is, look, you nailed it. The IT apparatus has moved to the cloud because it's simpler to consume, but it also allows you to move much faster. I mean, you can spin up a data center with a script in minutes these days. You can write an application that spins up data centers to run one batch job and then tear them down. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of capability the cloud has afforded us. And what that means is it's opened up new opportunities for developers and engineers and DevOps folks to make decisions that could be exploited in ways that we've never previously thought about. And one of the major areas there is, wow, there's a tremendous amount of cost going into this. So I think there's two things. One is part of your security really does need visibility into why resources are being spun up. And it doesn't mean your security team should be your finance teams like, guard dog. That's not what I'm saying. There should be some potential fusion there, but you need to understand when it's the business making a decision, because what you see in a lot of fast moving cloud environments is crypto jacking on the low end and potentially more hijacking of resources on the high end, because nobody's really tracking costs because we're just moving so quickly. The other piece is the data, and cloud has created an explosion of data. You can look at a 200-person on-prem organization. We have a client, a real estate organization, large one that's in the transition to the cloud, but a 200 or 300-person organization, they had maybe 50 gigs of security telemetry. If I look at a 200 to 300-person organization that is building a cloud-native app, I've seen up to 30 terabytes a day in cloud telemetry that has potential security implications. So, in addition to, hey, things move fast, mistakes get made, we need to understand how we work and if we're working the right way to make sure that we're cost controlled and that we're not being taken advantage of by adversaries who have hijacked resources. You also need to understand how to properly marshal the security relevant data in your cloud. You need to look at the appropriate repos for debug, the appropriate use cases for when those types of logs may be relevant for security analysis, and make sure that you're architected not to just throw all of the data at the most expensive solution possible for daily analysis, because number one, your people aren't going to be able to spend the time to do it. But how do you shift and move data around based off of the right detection use case to make sure that you aren't overspending on your solution because there's data that's just not being used every day for detection.
Okay.
So I think those are the two main areas.
So it looks like we just got a few minutes left here, and I kind of want to circle back, and I'll leave you with the closing thoughts, but I want to kind of put a capstone, if you will, on what our discussion was here. We started out, thinking about security operations because we're getting requests from our client to provide protections, either technologies or capabilities in one way or another. And we find ourselves regularly stepping back and asking the why. And the why is, what is my risk and threat model? My why is, what is the cost of an attack or the cost of doing business in security operations, and the uniqueness and function. And kind of in that uniqueness and function, we saw uniqueness and change from data centers to cloud, in automation, and then push versus pull on how I consume my security operations data. So, as a whole, we've got to consider these anytime we're working with our clients to make sure that they're really having a security operations program that meets their needs. Any other closing thoughts to that? Like, how do we guide them to a solution that's best fit for them?
Yeah, I think that is really the core of it. The only things that I could think to add on to that are, again, the notion of core competency. What is central to my business, and how does that relate to security, or does it not at all, right? And then the only other piece is data. So, what data falls into the category of core competency, core to my business, and how should I respond to that in terms of hosting, not hosting, putting into the right type of system or putting into a lower cost type of system. All of that needs to be pulled together, I think, to make sure that you're really right sized on your security operation.
Outstanding. And I just looked at my time check. We actually have a couple more minutes left. So I'll offer up to any other questions from the group out there. If you've got them, go ahead and put them in chat. You can see us out there. I do want to pull on that idea, though, of right sizing that, right? And we have lots of clients that are right sized based on their investments and their capabilities to consuming some of those consumer model based, and we support those absolutely. And then we've got some where they want that external hand like BlueVoyant, where they know they've got the experience, the chops, the threat intelligence, and all that integration. And then we've got some that want to consume that and be pushing the technical edge and the process and people edge of things. And there's no one size fits all. So I'm always a little bit taken back when somebody asks me, well, what is the right tool for this solution or for a particular environment? And I don't know that there is a right tool writ large, but talk to me about how you guide some of your clients in that back and forth of, okay, your tool really needs to fit your security operations team.
It's a great question. I think ultimately what we always try to do is drive it back to the threat model and say, okay, here's an interesting tool or capability. What type of alert does it generate? What type of data sources are involved in creating this? And how does that plug into that threat model and that framework? Is it adding additional visibility? Is it adding additional response capability? Is it just doing executive reporting, which has a serious price, by the way? Like that is a very valuable thing that the industry has not solved. I've seen some pretty good executive reports generated by human beings. I have yet to see a tool that gets anywhere close with any of this. So again, it's really driving it back to how does this fit in to what your concerns are as a business in terms of who is trying to attack you? Is it a criminal use case for theft, criminal use case for ransom, and that can be ransom of operations? Is it at the level of APT, where you are worried about espionage, where you are worried about intellectual property, or some sort of required collaboration with the government? And how does this fit into that framework and help drive your mission there?
Outstanding. We've got a couple of comments in chat here. Clearly, there's interest around that automation, whether it's AI, machine learning, and what that means inside the industry right now, and who's using that for real, and how much of it is marketing terms. And then the other thing is kind of understanding your data, and I think you touched on that, right? This assigning severity and understanding classification. It's not something us security nerds like to do terribly, because I don't get to twiddle a bit doing it. But not understanding where my data is, how important it is to the business, really kind of leaves us contextually unaware, if you will.
Yeah, you have to do it. No one likes this. None of the business people like it. Not even the security people like it. But if you can't contextualize yourself at the data level, you pack up your toys and go home, right? Because you can't really then start to say, am I right-sized on my controls? Do I have the right visibility to make sure that I don't have portions of my environment that could be compromised, and data that, oh, gee, now that it's gone, I really, really care about it. You have to go through the exercise of understanding what data you have, how does it matter, how is it at risk, is it just ransom that we're worried about, is it theft, and then how do we need to go about protecting it? And if you're not really thinking about labels and how to read those labels, from both a human standpoint, reading and writing those labels, and a machine point, how to interpret those and make sure the right controls are applied, you're going to have gaps.
Absolutely. It all kind of points back to the IT world is pivoting to more of a consumption model, consumption of data, consumption of compute, consumption of storage. And now as an InfoSec industry, we've got to start thinking about that consumption model as well, and really understanding that this is all a giant business driver, right? Whether you want to think of it as sunk cost or you want to think of a BCDR, you've got to understand that articulation in your organization and really kind of capitalize on that to make sure that you're funded and directed in the right way.
My number one takeaway for anybody who's doing a big foray into cloud, a transition to cloud, and this is really infrastructure, right? Where you're moving applications that are unique to you. Go back and go make sure that your tagging process, really for your resources, but also for your data, is extremely robust and that you don't have blind spots. Yep. I cannot tell you how many times I come across organizations who say, we got this huge compute over here. And I go, okay, great. Like, what's it for? And they go, well, it's mostly for this, but about half the resources aren't tagged. So we're not quite sure what they're doing or what data's on there.
Yeah.
That is where an adversary wants to get in, be very low and slow, study the heck out of you and find that value and either ransom it or just steal it. That is a gaping hole for you. Absolutely.
And I think it's a shift in priorities inside of the information security space, right? The techniques and the technologies are out there and they're consumable. And now we have to start kind of going up to the meta level and understanding the data and the business implications, which is good. I think ultimately will lead to, a more secure infrastructure, but it is definitely a change for those of us that like flipping bits and looking at, x86.
And look, it's all theoretically easier because you can consume all of this information through API, right? And say, oh, well, I'll be able to find out everything I have because I can study the CloudTrail or something like that. That's true. You could theoretically do that. No one will ever make time for it. But what you can do is do the work up front to make sure you have a clean environment. Because cloud is a new playground or a new enough playground that you can do the right things to make sure it's set up right in the first place and not inherit the type of debt you did back in the day with like physical network integrations and mergers and acquisitions and the type of things that you got from inorganic or organic growth in the physical world.
Yeah, absolutely. So just, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So we're, I think, a minute and a half over, but just wanted to thank everybody today. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to Chris or I. Love talking about this stuff, as you can tell. And I hope you have a good security summit. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Cheers.
Cheers.